A prosecutor who was investigating the Trump administration strikes on fishing boats in the Caribbean, which by the way killed at least 211 suspected drug trafficking individuals, which by the way, no due process, we have no proof of that. Well, that prosecutor who was investigating these strikes has now been murdered. And the story gets worse. The prosecutor happened to be an Ecuadorian individual, and this is a bit of a trend that we're noticing in Ecuador. And the only reason why we know about it here in the United States is thanks to the fine people over at Dropsite News who have reported on it. So the administration claims that Operation Southern Spear targeted so-called narco terrorists who were trafficking drugs like cocaine and fentanyl into the United States. But of course, we could never know that they were drug traffickers for sure because they were killed without a shred of due process. There were no trials. And this is where prosecutor Alexandra Bravo comes in. Now, she was appointed to investigate the boat strikes, but also alleged torture that was carried out against those who survived the boat strikes. So according to a report from Dropsite News, Bravo was murdered in Ecuador. So this story is dark, and Crystal Ball covered it on Breaking Points recently. Here's a quick summary of what happened.
The reporter Camila Lourdes Galarza says that a prosecutor investigating US boat strikes and claims of torture was murdered in Ecuador. So the TLDR here is that this prosecutor was appointed to investigate not only the boat strikes, but there were a number of survivors from these 3 different boat strikes. And they all claimed a very similar series of events, that after the drone strikes, then they were apprehended by what appeared to be US service members. They were held for more than a week. They were tortured. And then they were dropped in El Salvador. The US denies all of this. Their feet were torn to shreds. So there was evidence of this alleged torture. And this woman who was appointed to investigate this as a prosecutor has now been assassinated on the street in Ecuador. Her sister, who tried to save her life, was also killed. Her security detail that she was supposed to have, because it is unfortunately not uncommon for these types of investigators to be assassinated in Ecuador, that security detail, Sagar, nowhere to be found.
So understand that the allegation among the survivors of these boat strikes that the US has been carried out is that after they survive the strike, they're then detained by US service members and then tortured. And so that is what was being investigated by Bravo, and then she's assassinated. 2 of the boat's crews returned home and reported being abducted, blindfolded, and starved for 8 days by American gunmen in US military uniforms aboard a US flagged patrol ship before being abandoned in El Salvador. Yeah, the US certainly under the Trump administration certainly loves to abandon people in El Salvador. Some of the men have just disappeared entirely. The UN Committee on Enforced Disappearances endorsed the calls for an investigation, demanding that the US provide information on the whereabouts of the 8 still missing men and any involvement in the matter by April 27th. To date, the United States has not responded. So that brings us to the government of Ecuador, because if this is being carried out by American service members, if American service members are torturing Ecuadorian fishermen who survived a US strike on their boat, well, why wouldn't the Ecuadorian government want to do something about it? Well, it turns out that Ecuador's president, Daniel Noboa, is actually a Miami-born billionaire who's very close to the Trump administration, and that does not bode well if you're seeking justice in this case. So he's even described as a US-backed dictator in Ecuador. So Bravo was under pressure from her superiors at the Attorney General's office to basically treat these US attacks, the strikes on the boats, exclusively as, or the strikes on the boats and then the disappearance, the torture and disappearance as simply disappearance cases. Like, don't look into the torture allegations. Just treat this as, it's a disappearance case I'm looking into. And that's according to a source within the Manta Police Department who actually knew Bravo personally. Here's what the source said. Bravo was told to close all lines of inquiry after 36 of the 44 missing men were found. despite arriving with severe injuries, including 70% vision loss and feet torn to flesh and bone, which medical experts found consistent with their accounts of explosions and torture. And now Bravo is dead. She was killed, she was murdered. Bravo is not the only one that this has happened to, which really does reinforce the notion that Ecuador is currently being led by a Trump-backed dictator. So Bravo is the 26th member of Ecuador's justice system to be assassinated since 2020, and the second individual investigating state crimes murdered just that week, in 1 week. Notably, boats from Noboa's family shipping corporation were caught trafficking 26 million pounds of cocaine, a detail that has not deterred the State Department from naming him a key partner in Trump's war on drugs. Last month, The Guardian reported that a whistleblower who was investigating Noboa's ties to drug trafficking was murdered. And then you have human rights lawyer Fernando Bastias, who's also a member of the Geneva-based World Organization Against Torture. In an interview with Dropsite News, he said, "I can't make any assertion regarding it being a political assassination, but evidently when a prosecutor is killed, it's because of the investigation they're conducting." That's something we've learned from our experience in Ecuador. However, despite both Ecuadorian government's efforts to stonewall the investigation, evidence does continue to mount, supporting the fisherman's account of abduction, airstrikes, and torture carried out by American service members. That used to be a huge scandal here in the United States. You know, when torture was being carried out against suspected terrorists, stuff like waterboarding, that was a huge scandal. And now I guess it's just happening and no one really cares. No one's reporting about it other than Dropsite News. Now, Jake Tapper seems real salty about Dropsite News. And if he wanted to, he could be a journalist. He could do his job and he could report on a story like this. Question is, will he? Unlikely. So instead of hating on Dropsite, maybe you can level up once in your life, but I doubt that's gonna happen.
Every time you ring the bell below, an angel gets his wings. Totally not true, but it does keep you updated on our live shows.